The roots of the crisis surrounding missing and murdered Indigenous women trace back to centuries of systemic oppression, forced displacement, and cultural erasure. For generations, Native American and Alaska Native communities have endured policies designed to dismantle their way of life, including forced removal from ancestral lands, the seizure of territories rich in resources, and acts of violence that sought to silence their voices. These historical injustices have left deep scars on these communities, creating conditions where violence against Native women has become alarmingly normalized. Today, this legacy continues to manifest in alarming rates of assault, abduction, and murder within Indigenous communities. It is not merely a statistic or a headline, it is a lived reality for countless families who grieve the loss of loved ones and struggle to find justice in a system that often fails them. The scope of the problem. The issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women is far more than an isolated phenomenon. It represents a pervasive and deeply entrenched crisis affecting entire communities. Women and girls are vanishing without explanation, leaving behind families desperate for answers. Others face unimaginable acts of violence, with little hope of seeing their attackers brought to justice. This epidemic cuts across all aspects of life, impacting those living both on reservations and in urban areas. While reservation lands bear witness to some of the highest rates of violence, the plight of Indigenous women in cities remains largely overlooked. Despite making up a significant portion of the population residing in urban centers, their struggles go unnoticed by mainstream society. This invisibility compounds the challenges they face, as data collection efforts rarely account for their experiences, further marginalizing their stories. Barriers to justice. One of the most significant obstacles in addressing this crisis lies in the complex web of jurisdictional authority. Law enforcement agencies operating on tribal lands often lack the resources necessary to effectively investigate crimes, while coordination between tribal, state, and federal authorities can be fraught with confusion and inefficiency. As a result, many cases remain unsolved, leaving families without closure and perpetrators free to commit further harm. Compounding this issue is the profound mistrust many Indigenous people feel toward law enforcement due to decades of neglect and abuse. This distrust discourages victims and their families from reporting crimes, exacerbating the underreporting problem. Additionally, the misclassification of victims' identities on official forms contributes to the erasure of Native women's experiences, rendering them invisible even in death. Human trafficking adds another layer of complexity to the crisis. Indigenous women and girls are disproportionately targeted by traffickers who exploit vulnerabilities such as poverty, homelessness, and lack of access to social services. Yet, identifying and supporting these victims proves challenging due to insufficient training among law enforcement personnel and limited availability of specialized services tailored to their needs. Urban versus reservation realities. While much attention focuses on the violence occurring on reservation lands, the experiences of Indigenous women living in urban areas cannot be ignored. Approximately 3/4 of Native Americans reside in cities, yet their voices are seldom heard in discussions about safety and justice. The unique challenges faced by urban Indigenous populations include isolation from traditional support networks, inadequate representation in local governance structures, and barriers to accessing culturally relevant resources. Despite the prevalence of violence in urban settings, research into its scope and impact remains woefully inadequate. This lack of understanding perpetuates harmful stereotypes and prevents meaningful action. By failing to recognize the diversity of experiences within Indigenous communities, society risks perpetuating the very inequalities that contribute to the crisis. The role of data and advocacy. Accurate data collection is essential to combating the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Without reliable information, it becomes nearly impossible to allocate resources, develop effective strategies, or measure progress. Efforts to standardize reporting practices and create centralized databases represent crucial steps forward, but much work remains to ensure these systems adequately capture the full picture of the problem. Community-led initiatives play a vital role in filling gaps left by institutional failures. Grassroots organizations tirelessly advocate for policy changes, provide direct support to